humanity is visited by a cosmic horror the likes of which has only been seen in Lovecraftian horror. In desperation, Earth throws everything we have at it, and, miraculously, the human race has killed a god. Somewhere in a realm beyond our understanding, the other gods speak of the event. Story 1. Death is a strange thing. To most of the universe it might be considered a constant. It is something unavoidable, and in a twisted way brings meaning to life. To those of the forgotten church, death was more of a concept. It was an interesting idea that offered respite from the toiled labor of unceasing existence. So, when it finally came, none knew exactly what to make of it. Despite that, this event must be met with an answer. A resolute statement. Lesser entities have long feared us. What are we to do when that fear erodes? When it is replaced by curiosity? The voice of silence yet found spoke, ethereal and jagged. And what answer would you have of us? Replied solace once given. That we go forward and destroy them? That we act as we did in the time before light? That we rush blindly towards all perceived as alien and smother it out of existence? I need not remind you how long we suffered in the blackness before, lost without time. A few of the other high church twisted uncomfortably in the nebulous cloud. Well, at least it seemed that way. In truth, meeting in this dark purple and black birthplace of stars was more out of ceremony and necessity. Since the Reformation, each had been linked. All creatures present before the light birth shared a shard of the blackness before deep within them. Through that piece of jagged emptiness, they were bound. It was this same piece of the long-forgotten blackness that roared in rage, agony, then complete silence when Sans Not Disturbed had ventured forward into the cosmos and found that strange blue planet. You make it sound as if these events are comparable, spoke Silence Yet Found, as if the destruction of one of our own kin by a sentient being sits on the same scale of relevance as wound inflicted by distant supernova. Is it not? Wondered Light Soon Forgotten. Is this not also a natural working of the universe? The creation of these creatures, then their subsequent rise to sentience? A few echoes rang out through the gaseous fog of the nebula as entities spoke softly to themselves or one another. None had forgotten the lessons imparted unto them when escaping the blackness before. That you must let things, even alien, grow and flourish, you have yet to understand what light they may come to bring. Perhaps we observe, then. Light Soon Forgotten had yet to speak at any of the rarely hosted meetings of the church. He was, after all, so young as to barely recall the darkness before. It was no secret that the opinions of those long lived in light held little sway in the minds of those long steeped in the blackness. They are still incapable of travel. Why else would they have not expanded their domain? In the opinion of this member of the congregation, we are provided a unique opportunity. We might learn from a safe distance, disturbing not them or ourselves in the effort. A greater rumbling stirred amongst the participants. True, the threat of annihilation was a new one. Yet that in and of itself was so interesting. After countless millennia, there were finally new thoughts. New fears. Despite the cold package in which it came, the warmth and brilliance of new ideas was intoxicating. Ideas spoken from a tongue which has only known the warmth of stars birthed, spat Silence Yet Found. A few of his monstrous tentacles cut through the purple fog, leaving large swaths of agitated vapor in their wake. You would let them fester. How long then, do you think, until they do escape the confines of their worldly prison? Would you still observe when they inhabit a whole system? Or is it more in your interest to let them desecrate the whole of a galaxy before you feel we need intervene? Light Soon Forgotten had known his speaking might be out of turn. Even still, the direct irritation of one of the Ancient was distinctly disturbing. Apologies, Ancient One, Light Soon Forgotten spoke, drawing his appendages inward to make himself smaller and servient, but... Enough, Solace Once Given boomed, do not backpedal, young one. Even if your skin is more accustomed to light than dark, your words hold wisdom. Solence Once Given turned his hulking frame slowly in the cold mist towards Silence Yet Found. Their thousand eyes met each other in a cold stare. Or would you attempt to speak to me in that manner as well? The silence which overtook the nebula for a few moments was all the reply needed. We go with numbers. All in attendance of this meeting will embark to this strange oddity, and we shall observe. Unless, of course, they deem the trip too dangerous. As Solace Once Given spoke the final words, he glared his countless orange eyes towards Silence Yet Found, who dismissively flipped a handful of tentacles. Though he would never admit it, even he was intrigued by thought of new knowledge. New creations after so very, very long. The creatures began to depart, hulking bodies leaving streaks of purple fog behind them in the blackness of void. So many moved that where their convoy went, the stars were blotted out, only momentarily showing pricks of light between countless masses of gangly and twisted tentacles. Story 2. Mr. A, did you hear? Some men killed God. I hadn't heard that. Mrs. B, thank you, said Mr. A, and he loaded his pipe, puffed absently, watched the blue-gray smoke as it curled up into the eaves. It's true, Mrs. B went on, voice warbling, her eyes dark and acquisitive, red-rimmed like a magpie's. They say that God went back to Earth, you know, the one meaning to apologize. He'd forgotten something, see, and it caused quite some trouble. Only, and this is the really unbelievable part, they didn't recognize him. Can imagine that? God, unrecognized. I should think it would be obvious to anyone on account of the... She gestured vaguely, and Mr. A nodded. He wished that she would leave him to his pipe, and the birds. The real ones, who were singing very prettily right now, down the gently sloping field of green grass, and beyond that, in the wheat that grew up wild on the edges of his property, before the treeline. But of course, she didn't. Mrs. B went on warbling for quite some time, until his pipe was empty and that pleasant buzz had worn right off, and all he could think about was that first thing she'd said, some men killed God. Atomics, most likely, and that was his fault. He'd invented them on account of the A in his name, just like he'd invented apples, aardvarks, and the alphabet. A mistake, though not one that he could have controlled. Some things simply were. And now God simply wasn't. Why, it took the wind right out of your sail. News like that, other people were sure to overreact. But oh, where has the time gone? Mrs. B was saying. I have a pie in the oven, apple, if you must know, and Mr. B's hearing isn't what it was, sometimes misses the timer. I'm afraid I really must be going. Yes, yes. Away you go, said Mr. A. He stood to show her out, held her arm politely, kissed her sagging cheek. Watched for a moment as she trundled away towards the trees, knock-kneed and ungainly, half swaddled in a threadbare shawl. A woman old as time itself. Almost as old, in fact, as him. He spat into the flower beads and reloaded his pipe. So, he thought, God was dead. And he watched as the wind ruffled trees in a place that looked, for no particularly good reason, like a town in early 20th century Ohio. The neighbors would be out in force by now. Mr. C, D, E, and F. The wives, as inseparable as their husbands, organizing a commemoration of some sort. No doubt why Mrs. B was baking. By the evening Mr. C would come around to ask him to chair the meeting. Formulate a response to the God dilemma, and how was he supposed to do that, really? Why, they might even ask him to create another Mr. G. They were obsessed with things like that. Appearances. As if they were all slats in the same white picket fence. Mr. A blew a smoke ring. Contemplated it. Blew another, more complex, like he had all that time ago, and then another, until he blew cathedrals, airplanes, mountains. He blew smoke rings until the sky began to darken, and he saw Mr. C there, coming towards him across the field. Mr. C was tall and thin, and wore a little woolen flat cap and a corduroy suit, patched at the knees and elbows. After dinner he smoked fine cigars or played cribbage with the ladies, and on occasion he had been known to brew a very pleasant sort of brandy that had been introduced on Earth as, what was it now? Ah yes, cognac. In a few moments, Mr. C would clumping up onto the porch and ask him to address the God dilemma, and quite simply Mr. A was too tired for all that. Mr. A blew away his smoke cathedrals, and decided that he didn't want to hear God's name for a while. 1,000 years, perhaps, or more. And if he ever made another, filled out the neighborhood, perhaps he'd skip that letter. Go on to make H's, I's, and J's. Evidently there was something wrong with G. G promoted delusions. Mr. A didn't quite understand that, and thought he never would. There was something terribly illogical about the impulse to godhood. Why the man couldn't be content here, among pristine fields and gently rolling hills, with apple pies and airplanes and aardvarks, he just couldn't fathom. Mr. C clumped up onto the porch and sat beside him. He lit his cigar and began to smoke, which was a bad sign, because it was still too early for him to have eaten dinner. They blew smoke rings towards the setting, and the rings' edges blurred away in questions, and though neither of them were sad, precisely, there was nonetheless something bittersweet between them. Left by Mrs. B? Perhaps. Regardless, they just sat silent for a while, until Mrs. A called her husband to dinner. "Well, Mr. C," Mr. A said, "it's been fine." "Hey now, just a moment," Mr. C said. "After dinner, how about?" "I think now, Mr. A," Mr. C insisted. "Just a minute, love," Mr. A called out. His wife's face appeared in the window, still striking after all these years, and then disappeared. "This God business is very bad," said Mr. C. "Mr. D should never have invented death," said Mr. A. "Or delusion." Mr. A nodded sadly. "Or delusion. But now we are left with a problem," said Mr. C. "Are we?" "Of course. There are 8 billion, shall we call them people? 8 billion people out there, spinning on some damn misshapen bit of rock, and now they've killed their creator. And I think we owe them something," said Mr. C. "Another Mr. G? Why, yes. You will, of course, explain," Mr. A said flatly. And Mr. C puffed a while the sun set, and a fine dinner grew quite cold. "It goes like this," he said at last. "For all these years, God Mr. G had this project. And at first the project didn't work. He made it and remade it, over and over and over, kind of like you've built this house, with your own lips and hands, blown out of so much smoke, until it took a piece of himself. His sanity, unfortunately, but well. It almost worked. Mr. G went down among all these people and became the 10,000 faces of God, gave them a few rules, and now look them. Yes, Mr. A said, they have atomics. And whose fault is that? I'm not on trial here." Mr. C snorted, tendrils of smoke issuing from his nose. "But don't you see?" he said, "it was working. They were becoming, if not real people, then a kind of echo, sometimes pleasant. But now in a fit of terror they've killed off their own morality." "I wasn't aware that I'd created a Mr. M," Mr. A said. "Oh, come off it," Mr. C said. "You know what I mean." "No, I don't," Mr. A said. "Will those Earthmen go a little while and see what they do? If they're people, truly, they won't need a God for their morality. I'd like to think it's set in a bit deeper than all that." A thoughtful expression passed across Mr. C's face then. "You think a God isn't necessary for morality?" "Of course," Mr. A said. "I'm perfectly moral, aren't I?" The front door creaked open, and Mrs. A peered out. "My love," she said, "I know that time passes differently for you, but unfortunately some of us are still wedded to it. The aardvark has grown quite cold, and I am going to be bed." "Mr. C, dear, don't worry. I'm not mad at you." And the door closed on silence, stretching out towards a starless sky and smoke ring clouds. Mountains, rivers, oceans, dissipating where Mr. A had blown them, until they hung ghosted in distance like someone else's dream. Mr. C patted him on the knee. "Why, I thank you, Mr. A, he said, "that was quite an illuminating conversation. I'll have to think on it a while." "Mind you do," said Mr. A. "Now if you'll excuse me." Yes, said Mr. C. "Good night, my dear man." "Good night." Mr. A watched until the other man disappeared. He went inside and picked at the cold roast aardvark, drank a glass of that fine cognac. He looked in on his wife, who was asleep, and thought about when he had first made her. Blown her out of so much smoke. These gently curving wisps, sensual before the word, that had set his blood to boiling. And now? He went back onto the porch and packed his pipe again. Thought a while about godhood and delusion, a whole host of other things. Then he went to sleep, right there on porch, with his pipe perched unlit between his lips. And perhaps the world trundled on. Story 3. They have died. Meddled with a black hole again? Tried to embrace an organic species. And when did they die? The species killed they. You are mistaken, the waves have been clear enough. They have died at the hands of a small, organic species. That is impossible. How could? I keep telling you that you underestimate them. How nice of you to join us. These little creatures have more potential than you realize, something they just found out. Your affection towards bacteria is touching, truly. The bacteria that just killed one of us, we cannot let this stand. We must embrace them in their stead and wait until they return. No, I have plans for them. More useful to me alive. You will not touch them. And if we or it refuse, then I'll tell them how to kill you too. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more, YouTube thinks you might like these videos.